Welcome, and thanks for joining us for our daily Bible study called Two Steps Forward. I'm James, and this is Aid. We're up to episode 213, and in the Bible, we're in 1 Samuel chapter 18. Aid, any updates or anything you want to address before we get started?
No, I am still not buying myself anything. I said I was going to buy myself anything for 3 months. Why are you laughing?
Well, I think anything is an interesting...
Well, the other day I said that all of my gym shorts were too small, which is another problem. And I said, but I can't get new ones, even though this is something I guess I need. So that's the point of this, is I'm trying to redefine what I actually need. Like, what is a need? Because I have been using the word need very arbitrarily recently. And so I'm trying to get a handle on that.
So send your gym short donations to 2215 North Palmer.
Along with that, though, I've also been trying to get rid of some things. Mm-hmm. Yes, but I did a classic Aid thing where, first of all, I swore off buying anything for 3 months without putting any parameters on that.
Sounds like you.
Secondly, I threw away anything I didn't think I needed, which included, remember that charger? I was like, this could not be for anything we need.
Yeah, I took it out of the garbage and put it in
the
closet.
You did? Oh, good. It's for my Bluetooth wireless, or my Bluetooth shower radio, which at one point was a need in my life. See where the problem is?
Yeah, I do see it. Trust me, I'm well aware of the issues surrounding that. But, so the 3 months are almost up then?
No, it goes through August. Like halfway through.
Oh, good. We've got another month. But, so obviously things like food and...
Well, yes.
That kind of stuff is...
Well, yes, I'm eating. Clearly, this is why my gym shorts don't fit. But I'm also in the last 5 weeks of my program, so I'm getting more and more stressed about studying for boards, and it's great. It's almost over 5 weeks, but I just feel like it's going to be a really intense grind for 5 weeks. Which I don't know. I don't know, how do you go into something you know is going to be tough with. I guess I am more the type I want to just get through it and don't enjoy the process. I guess I don't really have a suggestion for how to do that.
Paul says, I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. I once said that, I think it was during my vicar year, to a lady, and she said, that sounds great. How do I get that? And I was like, I honestly don't know how, how to interpret that. I know Paul says it, but he doesn't exactly say, and here's the secret. But I've come to learn over time what it means. It means a couple of different things. My rewards are in heaven. God will give me the strength to get through anything right now, and God is with me in the process.
Oh, yes. That's what I was going to say yesterday when we were talking about David can have confidence in his battle with Goliath because he's had all these smaller victories like the bears and the lions and bears and tigers.
Yeah. He battled his way through Oz.
Yeah. But I was so panicked about my pre-boards.
Yep.
And then they were so hard, and I prayed throughout the entire 4-hour test and did well. So I'm like, well, God got me through that, and I'm still being faithful, and I'm still studying, and so I think that He'll get me through actual boards, which matter more.
Yep. And you have to trust His promises and His track records. So if He's been gracious to me in the past, I have to thank Him for that, and that'll give me confidence moving forward. And if He's promised me certain things, I have to make good and in other words, express faith in that promise too. So, all right. So we are again up to 1 Samuel 18. We're going to learn about this relationship between David and Saul's son Jonathan, and David and his wife Michal, who is Saul's daughter, here today. So read through chapter 18 on 1 Samuel 18 on your own, and then come back, and here's my personal summary. Saul's son Jonathan became very close friends with David, and Saul prized David so highly that he wouldn't even allow David to go home, but he gave David the highest rank in any mission that he personally went on, which is weird because David's probably 18 years old at this time, and you weren't even allowed to be in the Israelite army unless you were about 20 years old. So not only is he too young to technically be in the army, but he's actually leading missions in the army. When the Israelite troops came home from routing the Philistines, however, the women of the city sang this song about Saul killing thousands, but David killing tens of thousands. And Saul is deeply angered by this perceived lack of respect, and he started resenting David. An evil spirit, we're told, from God came and afflicted Saul the next day, and while David was playing the lyre for Saul to calm him down, Saul threw his spear at David on multiple occasions. David was successful in everything that he did due to the Lord's blessing, and Saul subsequently became increasingly afraid of him. But the Israelites loved David. Saul offered his daughter Merab to David, because remember, he had offered anybody who defeats Goliath his daughter's hand in marriage. But David didn't consider himself worthy to be the king's son-in-law, so Merab was given in marriage to a guy named Adriel instead.
Maybe he just didn't like that one.
Maybe he's just not that into her. Maybe that's the case. But he actually plays the same game with the next daughter. Because it says Saul's daughter Michal, however, was in love with David, and Saul offered Michal in marriage, hoping also that she would become specifically, he offers her to become a snare for David. In other words, like he's going to get so distracted by being with her that he's going to lose focus in his military issues. But the hope is that he's going to fall and stumble before the Philistines. But when David heard the offer, he again considered himself unworthy to marry into the king's family. And he reasoned, I'm only a poor shepherd. How am I supposed to, I can't pay for a dowry price for a king's daughter. Saul replied that the only bridal price that he wanted for Michal's hand in marriage was 100 Philistine foreskins. Weird request. But remember, the Israelites, not every ancient people group, in fact, relatively few performed circumcisions of the males. Philistines clearly didn't. And this, again, is sort of a trap, thinking that there's no way David's going to be able to procure 100 Philistine foreskins. David and his men actually brought back 200 Philistine foreskins, and Michal was given to him in marriage. Seeing how Michal loved David, Saul became even more afraid of him, and David was far more successful against the Philistines than any of Saul's other commanders. He became famous everywhere around the world for this type of military prowess and all these accomplishments. And that's where 1 Samuel 18 ends.
This is where David learns that trick about sending people into battle that he wants to get rid of.
Oh, yeah, it's a good connection. You're saying later on when he sends Uriah the Hittite, the husband of Bathsheba, because Saul was really trying to do the same thing to David here. It's good connection. So first devotional thought for the day, number 1, we're just going to call it Jonathan and David are one in spirit. So that's right there in verse 1. Jonathan, just a little bit of background on him. He's older than David. Some scholars will say he might be as much as 20 years older than David. Jonathan, we had already read in prior chapters, had multiple military victories. He was in charge of about a third of the army. At one point, Saul divides up troops, and Saul has 2/3, and Jonathan has 1/3. As for their relationship, the accusation of potentially, so when it talks about love between Jonathan and David, I remember hearing this multiple times from multiple outlets that maybe there's some kind of homosexual relationship. Maybe that's what's being discussed between Jonathan and David. And I guess my response to that would be, first of all, homosexuality in Israel, in the nation of Israel. So around the world, it was always potentially a thing. But in the nation of Israel, it was just unheard of. Because remember, the Israelites were ones who, for instance, stoned Israelites for extramarital behaviors, kind of thing. Very clearly, when you read through, Leviticus 18 and 20 both list homosexuality as a sin that is forbidden under the Mosaic covenant. So the idea that they would have some kind of homosexual relationship that the other Israelites even maybe knew about, it couldn't have happened in that culture at that time. And so it just really isn't a particularly, it's modern people reading modern concepts of love into ancient texts. And the love that's described here, really, it's just a friendship between David and Jonathan that indicates they're seeking the welfare of the other person ahead of self. So, there's a spot that we haven't gotten to this, but it references Jonathan's love being even greater than his love for his wife, that kind of thing. And
he does have a wife.
Well, he's going to have a wife. But later on, it's going to reference
Jonathan or David?
Whether or not Jonathan has a wife?
Yeah.
I don't know if Jonathan's wife is mentioned.
Oh, okay.
We assume that he does. David certainly does. In fact, he has too many wives eventually. But the relationship is described as greater than the wife of or love of a wife. And what that means is when you understand who David's wives were, we'll talk about Michal in the next point, his wife, or however you want to pronounce it, Michal or Michal. But she, at various points, is not particularly good to him. And Jonathan is always unwaveringly good to him. He's always placing David's best interest ahead of his own. And that's why the love is described as greater. It's not describing it in sexual terms whatsoever. It's just a friend who's a really good friend. Have you ever heard of this before, this concept that maybe Jonathan and David had some kind of inappropriate sexual friendship or relationship?
Yes, I have heard that before. Is it possible that maybe Jonathan did love him?
Like that?
Yeah. And if he did, I mean, I'm not in any way suggesting they had a homosexual relationship.
Yeah.
But if he did, I mean, I think today that people have different inclinations towards different types of sinful behavior, like different temptations.
Right. Even the simple example for anybody who would maybe doubt that is just men and women tend to face some different struggles sometimes.
Yeah, so I have no doubt there are men and women who have temptations towards feelings for
Same gender.
same sex. So I don't think would be crazy to say maybe Jonathan did love David, but because he is, I don't know, you don't use the term Christian, I guess, a God-fearing individual.
Yeah.
And wants to love and serve and obey God, he doesn't act on any of those thoughts, impulses, whatever. That's just, he is his friend and loves him like a friend, but I don't think it would be crazy to say like maybe he did have feelings for him above that. It's
a good, I think it's a good thing to think through because we know Christians like this today who have same-sex attraction but are glorifying God by living celibate lives. The idea that there were potentially characters in the Old Testament and New Testament who are glorifying God by fighting off different temptations, sexual or otherwise, like that wouldn't surprise me that was the case. So it's not that they never experienced temptation of the flesh; it's that they were honoring God ahead of honoring their fleshly desires. We're not told a whole lot specifically in regard to Jonathan here. It's escaping my memory right now if we're ever have a reference to his wife. But even then, in the Roman Empire, there's all sorts of kind of funny business about men who had wives but also had sexual relationships with not only other men, but in some cases young boys. So that just having a wife wouldn't necessarily exclude him potentially having those kinds of urges or anything.
Well, yes, you're not saying that he had relationships with.
No, not Jonathan. I'm saying in the Roman Empire we're in recorded history, so more modern recorded history, we have references of things like that. So
even today, having a wife does not
necessarily
preclude
exclude
someone from having same-sex urges.
Correct. So I think, do we have any reason to believe that's the case with Jonathan here? I don't think there's anything here that suggests that. I think they care about each other. I think they're just is it okay for two people of the same sex to just be really good friends and love one another so much that they desperately want what's best for the other person? Like, look at it like that. These are best friends that would give their lives for one another. So I don't see any reason to judge it as more than that. Devotional thought number 2 then, David's wife, Michal. Again, if you want to call her Michal or Michal or however we pronounce it. So the order of events here is David passes up the opportunity to marry Saul's oldest daughter, Merab. And he refuses because he deems himself unworthy. Then, eventually, Saul offers him Michal, and David refuses again at first because he still says, I'm unworthy. And then Saul says, okay, the only bridal price I want is these 100 Philistine foreskins. It's interesting in a couple different ways. I'm not quite sure the specific statement about Michal loved David. Like, how did she love David? What is that? Does she have a strong affection for David? Was she I'm guessing a lot of people in the nation of Israel were kind of swept up in the heroic qualities of David. Does that mean she's just kind of this fan of, he's handsome. He has this newfound fame. Maybe she's just drawn to his faithfulness because he was the only soldier that actually trusted God's promise and was willing to go out onto the battlefield. Anyways, there's a lot of interesting things that we're going to get to eventually regarding David in this marriage. Michael is going to save David's life at one point. When Saul gets so angry at David, he comes to their house, he sends men. Michael lowers him down through the window and he escapes. So she loves him and saves him then. At that point, Michael is actually given away in marriage by her dad to a guy named Palti. And so that becomes a whole thing where David has to get her back. There's kind of a famous incident where David dances when the Ark of the Covenant is being brought into Jerusalem. And he dances so kind of, from her perspective, inappropriately.
Well, I think it's just so she's a Lutheran, clearly.
Because he's doing praise dancing?
I don't think, because he's praise dancing. I don't think it's, when you say inappropriate, I don't think it was like sexual. Like, I don't think he was like stripping.
Well,
but I think he was like, what's the word? Like without any.
It specifically says that he's dressed like a slave or something like that. He's not in his full state of dress. And she thinks that there's a level of immodesty attached to it. So he might be, like half naked, but he nonetheless didn't think there's nothing sexual about it. The idea is that there might be something immodest about it, and there might be something kind of inappropriate from you're supposed to be the king of Israel. Don't behave like that.
Well, yeah, that, and also like, I don't know, even like I know men swim without their shirts on or whatever. But even if you're like outside without your shirt on, I'm like, all the neighborhood women can see my husband without, like, half clothed. Like, you should know better. Like, what are you doing?
And you should see them run to their windows. It's really quite a stir.
So maybe it was kind of like that. Like, you're showing all of Israel what only I'm supposed to see.
Maybe. I suppose that's possible. But I think what's interesting then is the Lord very clearly, we're told in 2 Samuel 6 that the Lord sort of makes her barren at this point because she is chastising the Lord's anointed for being excited to celebrate the Ark of the Covenant in God's presence. And God says that is so inappropriate that your womb is closed in this time. So God reprimands her for that.
Well, clearly I don't know this story because all my guesses are wrong.
We will get to it eventually. It's one of those interesting things that it's like, okay, what exactly does this mean and what are we supposed to take from this? But we'll get to that. For now, the third devotional thought then is, so I want to do a little bit of an intro to Jonathan and David and a little bit of an intro to Michael. But the third devotional thought is Saul's passive-aggressive cowardice. So we know that Saul has this nature of being a coward. From the moment of his inauguration, he's in hiding because he's a coward. It wasn't until the Spirit of God came upon him that he encounters some bravery, and then he has all these impressive military successes. And Saul becomes this proud guy at that point that starts to want to do things his own way. And God rejects him as the king, and his spirit departs from Saul. And actually a spirit from God, a wicked spirit from God, is sent and torments Saul. And from here on out, we just see like the worst of him. And it's progressively worse. And that is in contrast, it's recorded in contrast to David's faithfulness. And you'll notice what a coward does when they really hate somebody is they don't get aggressive. As a coward, they get passive aggressive. Passive aggressiveness is the idea that you're seeking the downfall of somebody else, even though you don't want to be the one that looks bad to make it happen. And so look at the routes that Saul goes to try to bring about David's downfall. Number one, he assumes that the Philistines, David is not a trained military general. And so by putting him in charge, in some ways, he might be setting him up for failure, what he thinks will be failure when Saul puts David in command of these missions. Secondly, we're very clearly told that he gives his daughter gives her hand in marriage to David so that she would be a snare, a trap. Very clearly, the word that's used here is so that she'll be a trap for him, so that he might get distracted and the Philistines would overtake him. So he's leveraging his own daughter as a way to possibly bring about the demise of David. The third thing is that whole bridal price thing of 100 foreskins. Like, very clearly, this is going to be a dangerous type of mission. You have to not just kill 100 guys, but you have to kill them and like meticulously go through this process of bringing back portions of them as a trophy. He assumes that could bring about the downfall of David too. So all of it is very clearly Saul being like, there's moments of aggressive where he throws his spear, but the rest of it is this strategizing passive aggressiveness. And wow, Christians, I know a lot of Christians that know they're not supposed to be aggressive, and so they don't get into a whole lot of fights, but holy smokes, are they passive aggressive. And they very clearly are like behind the scenes rooting for the downfall of others, including other Christians sometimes. And I think I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to talk about that sin of passive aggressiveness. How prevalent do you think it is? What forms do you think it takes? Do you know anybody that you think struggles with this a ton?
Very prevalent. So here's the thing. I think that most women are passive aggressive, and
do you think it's more prevalent in women than men?
I do.
Yeah.
Because I think women, for whatever reason, care more about like smaller things. So because I'm aggressive, and socially it's acceptable to be passive aggressive, it's not socially acceptable to be aggressive. So that means I have one of two choices. I can either be aggressive, and doesn't always mean physical. Like, you can be aggressive verbally.
Sure. Like,
people know what I'm thinking, they know when I'm not happy.
Blunt, straightforward, assertive would be maybe more positive.
Yes. So, but I know that's not always appropriate. So what that causes me to do is just to kind of disregard or put aside a lot of things that I'm worried about that really I should not be worried about. So what someone else's situation is versus my situation, what someone else's advantage someone else might be getting ahead of whatever, or what someone else is doing that I don't approve of.
Yeah. It's really interesting for you because I would say specifically for you, aggressive is more a temptation than passive aggressive. But I would say as a general rule, so guys often, I think you're right when you say it's probably women who struggle more with passive aggressive. I don't know a whole lot of women who are inclined to just get into like physical, women sometimes just don't think in terms of physical violence. I know guys that struggle with like being hot-tempered, aggressive. I don't know as many who are passive aggressive, but I've known plenty of men and women, but I think probably more women than men. I've talked to some at some point and just have said, just be totally honest with me. I feel like you are rooting for me to fail on this right now, even though like on the surface you're smiling at me and whatever. Like, be honest with me. Tell me if that's a thing and why is that? Like, what do we need to reconcile? Because right now, not only are you seeking my downfall, but you're like being deceptive in the process. So it's this really kind of wicked and sinister force.
I guess I would encourage people, like, if something really bothers you and you think that there's a legitimate like concern behind it for the other person, then I would just say something to that person. Like, you would feel better, they would maybe be aware of something. But if you don't think that it would be appropriate to say something to them, then you just have to let it go. You can't like fester on it or try to like slide in some dig or something.
Correct. So yeah, God's mechanism for relieving some of that tension is forgiveness, which literally means in the New Testament, aphiemi. The Greek word is to let it go. If you're upset with somebody and you don't actually address that either by talking to them or by just forgiving them in your heart, what you're doing when you just push it down, what most guys will eventually do is explode. I don't want to be over gender specific about it, but what some women will do is implode a little bit. And I'm probably more like passive aggressive in times like that. But the idea then is like subconsciously you start taking it out on people and you start like snickering at them and again, almost like plotting their destruction, but it's like a cowardly way of seeking somebody's destruction. So not only is it bad that you're seeking their ill will, but you're doing it with a cowardly attitude.
Well, and I think you start gossiping about them.
Yes.
So if you ever catch yourself
Yes.
talking to one of your female friends and at the end you look at each other and you say, just something that we should pray for her about, that is gossip.
Yes, read between the lines. The gossip is a perfect example of it, because the reality is you don't have the guts to say what the problem is, even if it's a legitimate problem, but you don't have the guts to say it to that person's face. So instead, I'm going to sort of bring the community against them by spreading some of this stuff about them. So yeah, that's a great example of that type of temptation. Point being, you either need to talk to the person directly, which is usually the best option, and reconcile that way, or at the very least forgive the person in your heart if you're willing to, because otherwise you're going to subconsciously take it out on them, and it's not going to be good for you either. So anything else on 1 Samuel 18?
No, and I'm not saying I do that any of this perfectly.
No,
you know.
neither of us do. But you can't repent of sins that you don't know you're aware of, and you can't hit targets that when you're not aiming in the right direction. And so that's what we're trying
You
to.
miss every shot you don't take.
Well, I don't know if that applies here, but that's what I think. I don't know that I've ever heard the sin of passive aggressiveness called out before, and I think what we're seeing in Saul.
Because again, it's kind of acceptable in society.
It's kind of
You see it all the
acceptable.
time.
It's kind of beneath the surface, or running in the background, and I think Saul's behavior here is a perfect opportunity to call it to attention. So, all right, would you mind closing us out with
Sure.
prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for one more, what we sometimes call story, but really isn't. One more like historical account that, again, points towards you and everything that you've done for us. Please help us to take the examples of Saul and David and find ways to apply them in our own lives, either things that we're convicted of, like gossiping or being afraid to confront someone, or even not forgiving someone for something and just letting it go. So please forgive us for those times and give us, pray that the Holy Spirit would give us strength and courage to deal with any conflicts like that we have, maybe festering in our lives. So as we go through the rest of the week, please help us to keep our eyes and minds focused on you instead of focused on ourselves or what's going on with everyone around us. Amen.
Amen. Thanks again for studying with us. We will see you next time for 1 Samuel chapter 19.